I'm Corbett Wall with DV Auction, here with your feeder flash for Wednesday, April the 4th. And we've been talking about this as we approach this so-called wall of fat cattle, the heavier supplies of market-ready cattle that are going to be hitting here later this spring. And we've been watching our live cattle futures fade. We knew that it was going to be hard to keep these fats over $1 throughout that glut of cattle. But on Tuesday was the first time that we saw them drop below that on the board. But both June and August fats, live cattle futures closed below $1. And a lot of people starting to talk that maybe that's a little bit cheap, it's kind of undervalued, especially on the August. Because we've been looking, the last 2 or 3 weeks, receipts of feeder cattle have been extremely light. Your wheat cattle have come off long ago, so there hadn't been any of those going on feed from that. This particular week, receipts are just drastically light. And if there's no feeder cattle out there, there hasn't been any going on feed the last 2 or 3 weeks, and we're not expecting many feeder cattle to be going on feed for the next 2 or 3 weeks out or so, or even farther. Where's all these August fat cattle going to come from? And I think a lot of people are thinking that if it was the old days when they had a lot of those old crusty old school guys, they would be diving into that August live cattle futures and causing it to come up, putting on some Texas hedges, you know, having cattle on feed and buying the board too, just working into that. You would think that these packers would get extremely aggressive on their chain speeds, because they're making so much money, especially now that they've dropped the fat cattle market another $3 or $4, just making money hand over fist. You'd think they would turn that thing up as fast as it would go. But you know, I try to talk to people all around and share what I hear, and talking to one of my favorite order buyers and a good friend of mine, we've sat around and talked about the market an awful lot, and he says the problem with your markets these days is you're missing your main 2 ingredients, and that is greed and guts. And we didn't used to have a lack of that, especially back in the 70s and 80s. I mean, if there was a chance to make $1, everybody was jumping on it. And most of our economic models only work well if everybody, assuming that everybody is trying to make as much money as they can make. But your packers have become extremely disciplined because they've learned how to work this trade. They've got 80% of their needs already filled. So why push any harder on the handful of cattle that are going to make the recipe for what the whole rest of the cattle are going to bring? They use the freezers a whole lot more than they used to with this cryovac deal. And really the only people on the long side of the board, especially your live cattle, are just people that are playing with other people's money, just your fund managers and things like that. There's not a natural long hedger, because the only ones that would be your packers, and be damned if they're going to come into a market and support it. Even though they are going to be buying cattle in the future, so you would think that they would hedge that purchase, but they don't really need to. They got so much of their needs already filled that it would be foolish for them to support the market. But we've gotten below $1 now on June and August fats, and I think that August might be undervalued a little bit, like I said on the earlier week visit. But look at the board. June live cattle futures down $1.32 on Tuesday to close at 99.62, new low there. April spot live cattle down 42 cents at 111.97, and getting increasingly close to what the cash market is, as it dropped again on Tuesday. But then look at that August out there, down just 70, but under $1 at 99.90. Your May feeder cattle down $1.40. Ending the day on Tuesday at 130.97, and your April spot down 135 at 130.52, and it's getting well below what your cash index levels are, working towards $4 or $5 there. So maybe that's a little bit shy of what what the market ought to be too, in that there's no feeder cattle out there really for sale right now. We've sold all those cattle that had come off the wheat early because they were forced off, and we're just in a glut right here. And I know nobody's selling cattle in your open markets this week and probably last week, and everybody's talking about the cold weather. These guys know how to handle that. They're not selling them because they're scared to sell them. The cattle aren't bringing near what they thought they were going to bring, not near what they would have brought a month or 6 weeks ago. And they're just thinking, you know, there's not a lot of cattle out there. Why do I want to piss these things away? But look at your fat cattle trade on Tuesday. Texas and Kansas, famous for selling out early. We had a little 118 early, and then a lot of guys couldn't get that. It went to mostly 117. So 117 to 118 cash in the Southern Plains. That's $3 to $4 lower, and not a pile of trade, but plenty enough to establish the market. And remember, so many guys sold for that 2 to 4 week delivery that the packers just don't need that many cattle, guys. And so they're not going to push any more than they have to. And actually, you know, they may be lucky to get that 117 and 118. Up in the Northern Plains, it wasn't quite as bad, but they were selling, they sold some like that live too, but the bulk of the trade up in the north is on a dress basis. And then they sold some cattle in Nebraska and Iowa area. Colorado hasn't let loose of any yet, but from that 188 to 192, that would be $2 lower, but I think it's a little worse than that because it's heavy on the 188. But we've lost ground again on our fats. We knew we were going to. Box beef cutout values are drifting a little bit lower, but they have not fallen out of bed like cash fat cattle or the cattle futures have. They've just been drifting lower, and it's mostly just the select as we're getting increasingly more demand for those more expensive middle meats, and that's where your choice comes in. So those have been holding together pretty well. But choice cutouts Tuesday afternoon, $219.68, that was down just 12 cents. Selects at $209.33, down $1.17. Your feeder cattle market real-time index on Beef Market Central late in the day on Tuesday was at 134.76, down just 21 cents, and there's just not a lot of volume going in there. And it's hard to get it to move a whole lot when you don't have the volume in there to pull from the previous 6-7 days. But El Reno, Oklahoma at OKC West just having their calf sale, and those receipts have been light anyway, but just 750 head. Not even sure they'll clean the ring before they start Wednesday's yearling sale. They just don't see light receipts like that. Remember on Monday, the city in Oklahoma, city stockyards had just 1,900 head, and you just don't see that. It's just no cattle moving at all. Nobody's going to sell them, and there's not a lot of cattle out there for sale right now. But not a good test in El Reno. Ozarks Regional Stockyards in West Plains, Missouri, 1,560 head there. Didn't have a good test of yearlings, but the calves there sold $4 to $8 lower. And, you know, just not a lot of demand out there. And it's unusual when you see light supplies and light demand at the same time. But there's not a lot of people pushing on the feeder cattle. Most of your guys that have them or have some cattle that they could sell, they don't want to take what's being offered out there. We've got so many things pushing against your market on your feeder cattle. We've got these limited vacancy in your feedlots, which is hurting quite a bit. We've got a lot of fears of shortage of hay, and almost every ration out there, even your feedlots, you know, use some ground hay in there. We're getting short of that. Now we've come in there with a bullish for grain prospective plantings report, and that's ever so slightly pushing your grains up a little bit. And now you got people that are worried about a drought in the Midwest, which we get that every year about this time. Oh, there's going to be a drought in the Midwest. Ooh, we're not going to have any corn and everything. But, you know, talking to some of my old compadres up in the Midwest, and what he's hearing around the circuit is, you know, if it's that dry, this is the muddiest drought I ever remember. Because most of those guys up in the Midwest haven't worn anything but their muck boots for 3 or 4 months. You know, they'd love to pull on a pair of cowboy boots or pair of loafers, or even better, a pair of golf shoes or something like that. But it's just muck boots, day in, day out. And I know that Muddiest Drought Ever is a little bit tongue-in-cheek, because there really hasn't been a lot of significant moisture up there, but it always rains in April, and it's starting to rain, and guys are getting some gully washers that are filling the ponds in spots, and it'll come in other spots. But of course, the closer you get to the southern plains, the southwest, the drier it gets, and that's how come it's the Great American Desert. But it's cool temperatures everywhere. Everybody needs sunshine to get this grass to really pop, and it's downright cold, up in the northern plains and up in the mountain states and in the Midwest too. But down here in the Texas Panhandle, if we want to sit by the fire, all we have to do is get in the pickup and drive out in the country a little ways, and we can find a good range fire, and we can sit in the pickup and watch the fire and watch those firefighters risking their lives to try to save cattle and save outbuildings and homes and as much fence and dry grass as they can. But look at some individual quotes on Tuesday. Winter livestock in La Junta, Colorado. Pretty good quote on some calves there in a dry part of Colorado. 66 head of 568-pound steer calves bring $175. And you're wondering what's holding your average on these feeder cattle index levels up. Look at some quotes up in the northern plains. Riverton, Wyoming sold 76 head of 763-pound steers at $139.50. That's your feeder flash for Wednesday.